Before this story begins, take a second to subscribe. This channel uncovers real American crimes history tried to erase. Every story is deeply researched, emotional, and true. If you want more stories like this, hit subscribe now. The cell door slammed shut. The sound echoed through the stone hallway like a gunshot. Inside the narrow prison cell, a railroad worker named Thomas pressed his back against the cold wall. His hands were still shaking. Just days earlier, he had been standing beside the railroad tracks, shouting for fair pay. Now, he was locked inside a jail, treated like a criminal. Outside the prison, the streets were still smoking. Burned rail cars sat twisted and blackened. Soldiers with rifles stood guard over train yards. Across America, the Great Railroad Strike of 1877 had exploded into violence, and the government's answer was not mercy, it was prison. Hundreds of workers were dragged from their homes. Many never saw a fair courtroom. Judges rushed trials. Some men were sentenced in minutes. Others were locked away without charges at all. The message was clear. Fight the railroads, and you would lose your freedom. And this was only the beginning, because what happened next would change how America used prisons forever. Just weeks earlier, life had already been hard for railroad workers. The panic of 1873 had crushed the economy. Jobs were scarce, food was expensive, families struggled to survive. Railroad companies, some of the richest businesses in the nation, kept cutting wages again and again. By 1877, many workers had seen their pay cut by nearly half, but the work stayed dangerous. Long hours, broken equipment, deadly accidents, no safety laws, no job protection. Then came the final cut. In July 1877, the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad announced another wage reduction. This was the breaking point. In Martinsburg, West Virginia, angry workers blocked trains from moving. They refused to let the engines roll unless the cuts were stopped. At first, it was peaceful, but the railroads called for help. The governor sent in state militia troops. Many of those soldiers were workers, too. Some refused orders. Others laid down their weapons. The trains stayed still. That moment terrified the leaders of the country, because the strike began to spread fast. Within days, railroad workers in Pennsylvania, Ohio, Maryland, Illinois, Missouri, and New York joined in. Entire rail networks shut down. Freight stopped moving. Cities froze. Food supplies slowed. The economy trembled. Crowds gathered at rail yards. Workers stood shoulder to shoulder. Some carried signs. Others just stood in silence. Then violence broke out. In Baltimore, soldiers fired into a crowd. Several people were killed. In Pittsburgh, state militia troops opened fire again. At least 20 people died. The city exploded in rage. Rail cars were burned. Buildings were destroyed. The sky turned orange with fire. President Rutherford H. Hayes made his choice. He sent in federal troops. This was the first time the U.S. Army was used on such a large scale against American workers. Bayonets gleamed. Rifles were loaded. Soldiers marched through working-class neighborhoods. The strikes were crushed, not with talks, but with force. And once the streets were cleared, the prisons began to fill. Men were arrested in waves, sometimes for throwing stones, sometimes for shouting, sometimes for simply being nearby. Police made lists. Railroad companies pointed fingers. If a man had been seen at the tracks, he could be taken. In St. Louis, Chicago, Pittsburgh, and Baltimore, jails overflowed. Temporary holding cells were set up in warehouses. Guards worked non-stop. Trials were fast, too fast. Some workers were accused of obstructing commerce, others were charged with inciting riot. Many did not understand the charges at all. Lawyers were rare, witnesses were railroad managers or soldiers. Sentences were harsh. Men were sent to county jails, state prisons, and labor camps. Some were given months, others years. A few disappeared into the system with no clear record of release. Families waited outside prison walls, hoping to see a face at a window. Wives had no income, children went hungry, entire neighborhoods fell silent. The prisons were not built for this many people. Cells designed for one man now held 3. Food was thin, disease spread, guards were rough, prison labor was forced, unpaid, and brutal. This was not about justice, it was about fear. The government wanted to send a message to every worker in America: do not strike, do not resist, or this will be your future. Newspapers helped push the story. Workers were called mobs, strikers were labeled criminals, violence by soldiers was downplayed, violence by workers was shouted from headlines. But behind the prison walls, the truth lived on. Many of the men inside were not rioters. They were fathers, teenagers, immigrants, former soldiers from the Civil War. They had asked for fair pay and safer work. Now they wore prison numbers. In some cities, railroad executives quietly paid for stronger police forces and better jails. Private money helped public punishment. The line between business and law vanished. America had learned something new in 1877. Prison was not just for crime, it was a weapon. As weeks passed, the strike collapsed. Trains began moving again. Troops withdrew. The nation returned to normal on the surface. But nothing was truly over, because inside the prisons, hundreds of workers were still locked away, forgotten by the public, branded as criminals in official records, and worse things were coming. New laws were being discussed, laws that would make striking even more dangerous, laws that would make prison sentences easier to give and harder to escape. The men behind the bars didn't know it yet, but the punishment of 1877 was only the first chapter in a much darker system. And the next decision made by the courts would decide whether these prisoners would ever walk free again. That moment was approaching fast, and when it arrived, it would shock the nation. The courtroom was silent when the sentence was read. Thomas stood with his hands chained in front of him. He had been arrested for standing near the tracks. No weapon, no fire, no proof he hurt anyone. The judge did not look at him for long. The paper was already written. The decision had already been made. Guilty. The word landed heavier than the cell door ever could. Thomas was sentenced to 2 years in state prison. Around him, other workers received the same fate. Some were given months, others years. A few were sent away so quickly their families never knew where they went. These were not careful trials, they were warnings. Across the country, judges worked fast. In Pittsburgh, Chicago, St. Louis, and Baltimore, courtrooms became factories of punishment. Evidence barely mattered. Being a striker was enough. Railroad companies sat quietly in the background. Their lawyers whispered. Their records were used. Their voices were trusted more than the men who had built the tracks. Prison sentences followed one after another. And once the gates closed, something terrifying became clear. The system was not planning to let these men go easily. Inside the prisons, reality hit hard. Men who had never been arrested before were shoved into overcrowded cells. Stone walls leaked cold. Straw mattresses were thin and filthy. Guards ruled with clubs and fists. Many prisoners were railroad workers who had spent their lives outdoors. Now they were trapped inside dark buildings where sunlight barely reached the floor.
Rules were strict and often cruel. Speaking could lead to punishment. Looking at a guard the wrong way could mean isolation. Some prisons still used silent systems where imprisoners were forbidden to talk at all.
Disease spread quickly. Fevers, infections, lice, tuberculosis. Medical care was almost non-existent. If a man collapsed, he was dragged aside. If he died, another prisoner took his place. The prisons were full, but the work never stopped. Prison labor became the next weapon. Inmates were forced to work long hours, breaking stone, repairing roads, or making goods sold for profit. They were not paid. Refusing meant beatings or longer sentences. Some prisoners were leased out to private companies. This system already existed in the South, but after 1877, it expanded. Convicted strikers were treated no differently from hardened criminals. They worked in dangerous conditions. Accidents were common. Complaints were ignored. For the railroads, this was a quiet victory. Workers who once demanded wages were now free labor behind bars. And the message spread quickly across America. Strike and you could lose everything. Outside the prison walls, families suffered. Wives searched for information. Children waited at train stations and courthouse steps. Some families never received official notice of sentencing. Letters went unanswered. Visits were rare and tightly controlled. Entire neighborhoods felt the loss. These were working-class communities. When men disappeared into prisons, rent went unpaid, food ran out, children left school to work, poverty deepened. Charities tried to help, but fear was everywhere. Supporting strikers now felt dangerous. People whispered instead of speaking openly. The press helped keep that fear alive. Newspapers printed stories calling the imprisoned workers violent criminals. Headlines praised the government for restoring order. Little was said about unfair trials or harsh sentences. The story America was told was simple. The prisons had saved the nation. But inside those prisons, a different truth was forming. Some prisoners began to talk quietly, at night, during work details. In moments when guards were distracted, they shared stories. I never threw a stone. I was arrested at home. They said I led a riot. I don't even know how to read. These men realized something important. This was not about what they had done. It was about what they represented. They were workers who had challenged power, and power had answered with cages. Not everyone agreed with the punishments. A few journalists questioned the trials. Some church leaders spoke out. Labor groups warned that the government had crossed the line. But those voices were small. President Hayes defended the use of troops and arrests. Business leaders praised stability. Courts continued sentencing without hesitation. The precedent was now set. The state could use prison to break labor resistance, and it would not be the last time. As months passed, conditions worsened. Overcrowding pushed prisons beyond their limits. Guards grew harsher. Punishments increased. Isolation cells were used more often. Some inmates were kept alone for weeks. Mental breakdowns were common. Men talked to walls. Others stopped speaking entirely. Some begged to be transferred to work camps just to escape the cells. A few tried to escape. Most failed. Those who were caught were punished severely. Shackles, whippings, extra years added to sentences. Fear ruled every corner of the prison. And then something unexpected happened. In several prisons, guards noticed a change. The railroad workers were not acting like ordinary criminals. They organized quietly. They shared food, protected the weak, passed messages between cell blocks. When one man was beaten, others slowed their work in silent protest. It was small, careful, but it was resistance. Guards responded with force. Leaders were singled out. Transfers were ordered. Some men were sent to harsher facilities far from their families. Still, the idea had taken root. Even inside prison walls, workers could not be fully broken. This scared the authorities more than the strike ever had. Behind closed doors, officials debated what to do next. Some wanted longer sentences. Others pushed for new laws to criminalize strikes entirely. Railroad executives argued that strong punishment was the only way to protect commerce. Judges listened, and soon a new wave of decisions began. Decisions that would decide whether the imprisoned workers would ever return home or disappear into the system forever. The prisoners did not know it yet,
But the next ruling would be worse than the first, and when it came, it would expose just how far America was willing to go to protect power. The decision came down quietly. No crowds, no shouting, no fires in the streets, just ink on paper. In late 1877 and into the years that followed, courts across the country ruled that the harsh prison sentences handed to railroad strikers were legal. Judges said the government had the right to protect commerce. They said the railroads were too important to fail. They said order mattered more than protest. For the men behind bars, this meant one thing: they were not going home. Some prisoners had hoped their sentences would be reduced once the strike ended. Others believed the public would turn against the punishments. But as the months passed, hope faded. Prison gates stayed shut, and the country moved on. Inside the prisons, time stretched painfully slow. Days blended together. Work, silence, sleep, repeat. Thomas counted scratches on the wall to track the passing weeks. Others marked time by seasons they couldn't see. Winter cold seeped through stone walls. Summer heat turned cells into ovens. Food stayed poor. Guards stayed rough. Letters from home became less frequent. Some stopped completely. Families had broken apart. Children had grown older. Lives outside the prison had continued without them. This was the hidden cost of the strike. Not just broken protests, broken people. What made it worse was knowing why they were there. Many inmates now understood that their prison sentences were not mistakes. They were not accidents of chaos. They were planned. Railroad companies had demanded protection. The government had delivered it. Prison became a warning sign placed across the nation. Do not resist, or this is what waits for you. The effect was immediate. Across America, workers grew quieter. Labor meetings shrank. Organizers disappeared. Fear replaced anger. Employers noticed. Wages stayed low. Conditions stayed dangerous. Complaints were ignored. The lesson of 1877 had worked. Prison had crushed the movement. But the story did not end there, because while the strike was broken, the memory of what happened could not be erased. Some of the imprisoned workers were eventually released, not all at once, not with apologies. They were let out quietly, one by one, after serving long sentences. Many returned to towns that no longer welcomed them. They were labeled troublemakers. Employers refused to hire them. Neighbors avoided them. Prison followed them home. Others never made it out alive. Disease, accidents, violence. Their deaths were barely recorded. Their families received little information. Graves went unmarked. The nation did not pause. The trains kept running. But beneath the surface, something important had changed. The government had crossed a line in 1877. For the first time, prisons were openly used to control labor, not crime. Protest had been treated as a threat equal to violence. Courts had chosen power over fairness. Future leaders took notes. In the decades that followed, strikes would be met with arrests. Jails would be filled again. Troops would be called again. The blueprint was already written. Historians would later call the Great Railroad Strike of 1877 a turning point.
Not just for labor, but for prisons. Before 1877, incarceration was mostly about punishment after crime. After 1877, it became a tool to prevent resistance before it could grow. The prison system expanded. Laws became stricter. Sentences grew longer, all in the name of order. Thomas was released in the early 1880s. He walked out thinner, quieter, older than his years. The world outside felt unfamiliar. Machines had changed. Towns had grown. Friends had moved on. He tried to find work. No railroad would hire him. They knew his name. They knew his past. The prison sentence had done its job. Yet Thomas did not forget. Neither did thousands of others. They told their children. They told neighbors. They told anyone who would listen. They spoke of soldiers firing on crowds, of judges who never listened, of prison cells filled with men whose only crime was asking for fairness. Those stories stayed alive. They became warnings and inspirations. Years later, when new labor movements rose, leaders remembered 1877. They planned carefully. They organized quietly. They prepared for prison, knowing the cost. The strike had failed, but the lesson had survived. America often celebrates progress, but the truth is harder. The railroads grew rich, the workers paid the price, and prisons became the wall between power and protest. That wall still stands today, built brick by brick in moments like 1877. The last prison gate closed without ceremony. No speech, no apology, no record that justice had ever been questioned. By the early 1880s, the Great Railroad Strike of 1877 was no longer front-page news. The burned rail yards had been rebuilt. Trains ran on time again. Business leaders spoke of stability and growth. Politicians called the crisis resolved. But for the men who had lived through the prison sentences, nothing felt resolved. They carried the strike inside them. Every step away from the prison walls felt heavy, as if the iron bars had followed them out into the world. Former prisoners returned to towns that looked the same, but felt different. The streets were familiar. The faces were not. Some men found their homes empty. Families had moved away. Wives had remarried. Children no longer recognized them. Others returned to silence, where neighbors avoided eye contact, afraid of being associated with agitators. The label followed them everywhere. Former striker, former prisoner, troublemaker. Railroad companies shared names quietly. Blacklists passed from office to office. A man could walk miles looking for work and be turned away every time, without explanation. The punishment had not ended at the prison gate. It had simply changed shape. For those who stayed silent, survival was possible. For those who spoke, it was not. Men who tried to tell their stories were dismissed as liars or radicals. Newspapers ignored them. Courts offered no path to appeal. The law had already decided whose voice mattered, and it was not theirs. This silence became the final sentence. Meanwhile, the system that imprisoned them grew stronger. State governments expanded police forces. Courts refined laws against unlawful assembly. New charges were created to make protest easier to criminalize. Jails were expanded. Prison labor programs grew. All of this traced back to one lesson learned in 1877. Prison works, not to fix injustice, but to stop resistance. Business leaders understood this well. They did not need to win arguments with workers anymore. They only needed cells. The impact spread far beyond railroads. Miners, factory workers, dock laborers. Every group that considered striking remembered what happened in 1877. Organizers spoke in whispers. Meetings were held in secret. Some movements died before they began. Fear had become a tool, and prisons were its sharpest edge. Historians would later write about the strike as a turning point. They would analyze troop movements and economic data. They would debate whether the violence was justified. But what those books often missed was the human cost, the quiet suffering, the men who never recovered, the families erased from history. Prison records did not list broken futures, only sentences. Yet something else survived too. Memory. Stories passed from father to son, from worker to worker. Stories of soldiers firing into crowds, of judges who refused to listen, of prisons used not for crime, but control. Those stories shaped the next generation. They taught workers to organize differently, to prepare for repression, to expect punishment. They also planted a deeper question in the American mind.
If prison could be used this way once, what would stop it from being used again? The answer, history would show, was nothing. In the decades that followed, prisons were used against protest again and again, against labor, against political movements, against anyone labeled dangerous to order. The blueprint written in 1877 was never erased. It was improved. Today, the tracks laid by those railroad workers still stretch across the country. Trains still run. Profits still rise. Power still protects itself. And prisons still stand as reminders of what happens when resistance meets authority. The Great Railroad Strike of 1877 was not just a labor conflict. It was the moment America learned how to turn protest into a prison sentence. And once that lesson was learned, it was never forgotten. The silence that followed was the loudest part. Years after the prison gates closed on the last railroad striker, the country acted as if nothing had happened. No national apology, no public reckoning, no moment where leaders stood up and admitted the truth. America moved forward, but the system built in 1877 stayed right where it was.
By the late 1880s, prisons were no longer just places to hold criminals. They had become tools of control, sharpened and tested during the Great Railroad Strike. Lawmakers remembered how quickly fear had worked, how fast prisons had emptied the streets, how easily public opinion could be shaped. When new strikes appeared, the response followed the same pattern. Arrest first, ask questions later. Workers were no longer surprised, they expected it. The lesson of 1877 had sunk deep into the bones of the nation. Former railroad prisoners watched these events from the shadows. Some had survived, others had not. Those who lived rarely spoke loudly. Prison had taught them what silence was worth. But in private moments, they remembered everything. The cold floors, the rushed trials, the feeling of being erased. They saw younger workers facing the same danger and felt a quiet dread. History was not repeating itself, it was continuing. The railroad companies thrived. Tracks spread west, cities grew, profits soared. Executives spoke proudly about progress and order. Few mentioned the strike anymore. Fewer still mentioned the prisons. The men who built the rails were replaceable. The system that punished them was not. Courts cited 1877 in later decisions, not by name, but by logic. They ruled that the state had broad power during unrest, that commerce deserved protection, that protest could become a crime if it threatened stability. Each ruling added another brick to the wall, another reason prisons could be used against dissent. Prison architecture even changed. Facilities grew larger, more secure, more isolated, built to hold people longer, quieter, and farther from public view. What began as an emergency response became permanent design. The walls were learning from the past. For the families of the imprisoned workers, time did not heal everything. Some never recovered financially. Others passed down stories filled with anger and grief. Children grew up knowing their fathers had been punished not for stealing or killing, but for standing together. Those stories did not make headlines, but they mattered. They became part of America's hidden memory. By the turn of the century, labor movements returned stronger and more organized. They demanded laws, not just wages. They built unions. They learned to document abuse. They prepared for prison before protests even began. They knew the cost now. The strike of 1877 had taught them what resistance could bring. Still, the fear never fully disappeared. Every time a worker was arrested during a protest, the shadow of those prison sentences returned. Every time troops were called in, the echoes of gunfire from Pittsburgh seemed close again. The past never stayed buried. Historians would later argue over numbers. How many were arrested?
how many were imprisoned, how many died. But numbers were never the point. The point was what the state had proven it could do, and that power did not fade. Today, the story of the railroad strike prison sentences of 1877 lives quietly beneath the surface of American history. It is rarely taught in full, rarely spoken about honestly, but it is there, in laws, in prisons, in the fear that still follows protest. The men who stood on the tracks in 1877 believed they were fighting for survival. They did not know they were helping build a system that would outlive them all. Their punishment became policy. Their suffering became precedent. And so the story ends where it began, with a closed gate, with silence, with a country that chose order over justice, not because it had to, but because it could. If this story stayed with you, don't let it end here. Subscribe for more real prison and true crime history. These stories matter and they deserve to be remembered. Hit subscribe and stay with us for the next documentary.